Our book is called Ways with Words by Shirley Bryce Heath. Following desegregation in the South, teachers and students who were formerly segregated were now thrust together, and realizing that even though the students of Rhodeville and Tracton were geographically really close, there were huge discrepancies in the language acquisition and literacy of these two groups. This sets the stage for Shirley Bryce Heath's whole study. She wrote this book for the learning researchers like us.
So this book begins by giving details of the history of the Piedmont area of the Carolinas, which is the location for Rhodeville and Tracton. Mills were the center of these two communities, and the mill owners provided houses, churches, stores, schools, and post offices in the mill towns. Mill workers who lived in a company-owned housing were looked down by the townspeople. Schools were designated to teach mill children everything, like manners, morals, and everything in between. Teachers and preachers were the only ones who were able to break across the boundaries between the townspeople and the country folk.
So a little background, the actual layout of the two places. Rhodeville is located in Lawrenceville. It was a town of about 10,000 and began as the heart of Mill Village in the 1930s. There's an interesting mutual perspective about school for parents in Rhodeville. They say that once children start, their responsibilities are restricted to only making sure that children attend, bring their books, and stay out of trouble. Parents could offer little to no help on homework, and home assignments rarely got done. By the time they reached high school, the parents and children had written off any difference school could make for them. The skills their teachers promote were not going to help with the jobs they seek. Tracton is an all-black neighborhood only about 6 miles away. It had 8 two-family wooden houses. Many of these residents came to Tracton as to just not have their children grow up in the projects, or they didn't hear about any more decent housing for rent.
So learning how to talk in Tracton, language development in children of Tracton was not valued enough for parents to care to teach their children. In fact, the only language that was for certain that one could hear out of a 1-year-old child, for example, was screaming and whining. And it was no wonder that children in Tracton were so far behind in their language development. The people of Tracton would talk about their baby, but they would never or rarely talk to their babies. Adults did not encourage language. In fact, they believed that a baby was born to talk when she or he was ready. And then the children, when they reached toddler age, they were accustomed to watching their audiences. They would pick up on cues and utter single expressions. And when they did begin to communicate, they would do so by bossing, cussing, begging, teasing, and arguing with members of their community. And adults in Tracton did not perceive babies suitable for conversing in regular conversations. In fact, toddlers would just begin to pick up endings of adult conversations and would repeat those that they heard. And that was called the repetition stage.
After the arrival of a baby in Rhodeville, there was a lot of interaction from both neighbors and kinfolk to help out. Mothers in Rhodeville did not nurse their babies. They bottle fed them to allow the baby to get right on a schedule and let the mothers get back to work in the mill as soon as possible. Mothers had an understanding of their baby's language, though, and they would comment on motions or sounds that their child would make to explain the meaning to anyone who would listen. And when a young child would mispronounce a word, that new word was taken up by the whole family to replace the original. Children's language play was encouraged, and when children would begin to string words together into the beginnings of sentences, adults began to interpret and correct the child, modeling what they saw as the child's meaning. Children in conversation with their parents or other adults became both information givers and receivers. So again, the difference, what they talked about in the book was children they were coming up in Tracton, but they were brought up in Rhodeville. As far as storytelling, there was a big discrepancy, too, between even what it meant to tell a story in Rhodeville and Tracton. In Rhodeville, a story pretty much had to have a moral, similar to a testimonial, and stories were only allowed to be told on if the storyteller was the main character, was present as a designated representative. Old-timers who came to Rhodeville before the 30s to get their stories so the young would benefit from their lessons to pass them on. Children first met stories when their parents would read to them from books, and children in Rhodeville were not allowed to tell stories. They grew up being taught to tell the truth with all the facts correct. And then in Tracton, a good story in Tracton was based on actual events, but was creatively fictionalized. They called the best stories talking junk, which meant you had to highly exaggerate compliments or comparisons and use a lot of narrative. There was a dramatic use of dialogue, one of the most characteristic features of storytelling. And adults did not usually read books to children. There wasn't that flow of time, or there was a flow of time, not more routine activities. When stories were told among groups, children were not excluded from audiences, even when the topic was adult. School-age kids used a wide range of insult and verbal play to talk to each other.
Okay. And then there were literate traditions amongst Tracton and Rhodeville, and there were a lot of differences between how the people from both communities valued literacy in both reading and writing. So for reading in Tracton, children did not receive books as gifts, and reading was not modeled by adults. Therefore, recreational reading is just something that was not ever seen between adults and children in Tracton. And the only exception of that would have been reading the Bible. As far as writing in Tracton, very few members wrote letters, much more than just maybe quick reminders. Sometimes the greeting cards were perceived as the most popular form of writing among Tracton residences. Almost all of the writing was done by females. The only writing that males would do were to write out paychecks or public forms, tax documents, those kinds of things. And then reading in Rhodeville, it was a high priority to learn how to read amongst the folks in Rhodeville, and there was abundance of reading materials that were available for the community members. New books were bought for children as gifts, there was magazines and so on, but very few people actually read for recreational purposes. And then for the writing in Rhodeville, people wrote more than those in Tracton, but they didn't love it. They just viewed it as a necessary task. They would write letters as a part of a conversation train, for example, instead of making phone calls. Children of Rhodeville would write thank you notes or notes to their teachers and friends. They would write Christmas lists, fill out order forms, and etc. Opportunities and exposures were much greater in Rhodeville than in Tracton. However, really neither community's literate traditions prepared them much for school. And then the townspeople, this part of our book introduced another set of people, and they were called the townspeople. And they were the people who lived in the suburban towns around Rhodeville and Tracton, and they were known as the Gateway. Business owners, mill executives, preachers, teachers, and politicians, etc., were all of those who lived or were among the townspeople. The townspeople were white and black, and they were considered mainstreamers. They were very school-oriented. The two groups that made up the townspeople were the old-timers and the newcomers. And white families and black families placed good schools at the top of their change list as a priority. And the townspeople were always very involved with things like coaching, sports, school groups, junior leagues, YMCA clubs, etc. And then literature is present in the physical and verbal environment of babies in this community. Parents talk to their children face to face about everything around them in their environment. They were given opportunities to show lots of imagination and fantasy, and that was all incorporated in their conversations.
Okay, then Heath goes into actually having us teachers delve into ways teachers get to understand the differences in language and culture that these students all brought to their classroom. The ethnographies of communication in Rhodeville and Tracton became instrumental for teachers and students to bridge the language and cultural differences and to discover how to recognize and use language as power. Heath says that because she gets teachers to learn as ethnographers in a graduate level study. She had them come in and record all kinds of interactions about the language from these students in the 1970s. So they could see that they and their students brought home habits into the classroom. Simple, yet the complex task she gave them as they did this research was to do an even better job teaching. One of the big takeaway quotes was that the language a child brings with him to school should not be eliminated in an attempt to teach him standard English. Many black children at this time dropped that final consonant of a blend. Both Tracton and Rodeville children used words like ain't. Rodeville children often dropped the first unstressed syllable in word, like across. They would just say cross and things like that. Teachers at all the levels would complain about the students' manners and their absence of respect in most student behaviors. Teachers had to take it upon themselves to teach expected manners in all different ways. Bulletin boards, videos, home visits were quite popular, and then any form they can think of direct modeling and instruction. Teachers really began to alter their methods for accommodating the mainstream. They gave the students another way to approach tasks, and the one that stands out to me in the book was Mrs. Gardner. So in 1972, Mrs. Gardner had 19 black students who were deemed failures, potential failures, and they were hers for the year. So she went outside the box. She introduced letters to these kids, kindergartners, not just as symbols on paper, but structures, and brought them to life. They appeared all around the kids. They had to search for them and play with them and find them. And she took pictures of the kids in activities illustrating concepts that they had to understand, like over, under, bigger, smaller, but it was them that they could learn about. She projected a story in the auditorium each day and practiced words larger than life. That story for the kids was practiced again, where they acted it out with flannel boards and pictures. And anyway, I could go on, but she had these kids reading and having fantastic debates on stories. By the end of the year, all but one of her children was reading at grade level, and actually more of them were even reading above. She changed the way she taught, and she built positive self-concepts, and that made a world of difference. She wasn't the only one. Other teachers did things like real-life grocery stores to bring that right to the kids, road signs, and even made sports connections just to help their students relate. Even more, several teachers asked mill foremen, carpenters, plumbers, mechanics for what type of reading and writing they needed on the job. And some even agreed to come talk to their classes. Teachers were able then to draw on what students knew, what students could bring to school, to teach the teachers about their reading and writing needs and habits. When Tracton and Rodeville children go to school, they really meet a very different notion of truth and appropriate language from what they know at home.
Well, a study that stood out to me at the end of the book was from a group of fifth grade science students from Tracton, and they were primarily black students, and they were reading at about a second grade reading level. The students were set up as in this study to learn about plant life, but not only through hands-on activities, they also were learning how to systematically study people, cultures, and languages along the way. So these students had to imagine that they were brand new to a community who were assigned to set up an agricultural resource center in that area. They had to learn as much as they could about the growing of foods in that area by learning and talking to and interviewing farmers and local townspeople. Students also had to gather information from resources such as recipe books, artifacts, newspapers, and things like that to prove what kinds of foods were grown in that area. These students also listened to life histories of farmers so that they could write a summary. Along the way, they learned very important vocabulary words that they had never used before, and the support for this interactive learning was proven through their assessment, in which in this study every single student passed the assessment. So they had become ethnographers and learned a great deal about plant life. But the students used their inquiry and discovery learning, as well as developed appropriate language skills to be able to complete this unit. They were motivated, which boosts their self-efficacy, and they carried on conversations with local townspeople. Above all, they learned the language that it takes to talk about acquiring, integrating, and controlling their knowledge in schools.
And that's just a little bit about Ways with Words.
Thank you.